Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on Chapter 9, Income and Labor Market Inequality. The learning goals for this chapter are: what is the extent of income inequality and how does it vary by race and ethnicity and gender? What are some dimensions of labor market inequality? How do sociologists explain labor market inequality? Can affirmative action be an appropriate remedy for labor market discrimination? And what is the relationship between self-employment and labor market inequality? So how unequal is the United States today? Overall, inequality has widened in the United States since 1980. In 2014, the top 1% of earners earned 20% of all income. By 2018, the top 10% of earners were earning 12.6 times that of the bottom 10%. Inequality is further divided along racial lines. And here we see an example from 2020, what the median weekly earnings look like by race and ethnicity, where we see the amounts for Asian, white, Black, and Hispanic or Latino. We also have inequalities based on gender among the different racial ethnic groups. So you see that across the board, men make more money than women, but it varies. And then if you compare, for example, Asian men to Native American men, you see the discrepancies there, as well as among the discrepancies among women. So in this chart, you can really see sort of the inequality, the income inequality by both race and gender. The gender wage gap is more significant for women of color, as we see explained here, where for every dollar that white men make, this is the amount that white women, Black women, Hispanic or Latino women, Asian women, and American Indian women make in relation to a white male dollar. So you see sort of the varying discrepancies there, depending on your race for women. Now, while in the previous charts, we've seen that in comparison, when you're comparing income earnings, for example, between different racial groups, that the Asian population seems significantly ahead compared to other groups. However, if you only look at that statistic, then you would get a kind of skewed idea of how Asian Americans as a group are doing in the United States. Whereas when you disaggregate based on the varieties of different Asian American groups, then you see some variations there, where, for instance, Burmese and Nepalese folks are further down here, and Indian folks are at the higher end of the income scale. So there's significant variety across the scale here between making $30,000 a year versus $100,000 a year. There's a lot of variety and a lot of variance here among the various different Asian American groups. So that's something important to keep in mind. Now, the reading also talked about COVID-19 and sort of the different impacts COVID-19 has had on income equality based on race. So as the reading said, when America catches a cold, Black people get pneumonia, and you see the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on Black Americans were in line with this particular saying. So for instance, when talking about the numbers of people employed, Black Americans were particularly hard hit by the economic crisis caused by COVID-19, in large part because of their precarious economic position before the pandemic. So when you see here, starting from 1972 to 2020, the rates of employment for African Americans, you see it varying up and down and so on. But by 2020, April 2020 specifically, you see that 48.8% of the Black population is employed at this point. So while their situation has been precarious beforehand, they were, for the most part, above the halfway point of the population. But once something exacerbates the situation, like a global pandemic, you see how it hit African Americans in particular, dipping them back below the rate of half the population. Black small businesses were hit twice as hard as white ones, as you see here, where U.S. small business owners and self-employed workers who weren't working in April 2020, you see the discrepancy here. Again, at the population, the percentages of African Americans who were not business owners or self-employed workers was significantly higher that weren't working in April 2020, right? So a lot of their businesses were much more significantly impacted than the businesses or self-employed folks of other racial ethnic groups. We also see that when compared from 2000 to 2018 in this particular graph, Black Americans still earn less than they did in 2000. So in 2018, we see that while the income levels for whites and Latinos rose, the income levels for African Americans declined. So what data is it that we're looking at, and why does it matter when thinking about economic inequalities between different racial ethnic groups? Well, we look at household income, which means the combined earnings of everyone that lives in the household. Median annual earnings is the average amount persons earn in a year. An hourly wage, which only measures amount paid per hour. And these are distinct measures that each tell us different things about inequality. These also don't account for unemployment, right? So when you look at, this is only looking at people who are earning income, right? So when you add to the picture people who are unemployed, who are underemployed, then that also exacerbates, right, the rates of income inequality or economic inequality between different racial ethnic groups. For instance, we have here the Black unemployment rate, which has been twice the white unemployment rate for decades, right? So some things were impacted by COVID, of course, but when we see again historically, right, to the economic disparities between racial ethnic groups, we see that these inequalities have been a consistent, persistent experience for different racial ethnic groups. So how do sociologists explain these labor market inequalities? Well, one thing they look at is human capital, which means the educational attainment, skills, and job experience that an individual has. Differences in human capital explain some of the labor market inequality. But then there are other aspects that are not explained by human capital. So how do sociologists explain the earnings gap and differences in unemployment? Well, one is looking at individual racism, where racially discriminatory actions by individuals, such as not calling back an interviewee for a job because of their race, has an impact then on those discrepancies. There's also institutional racism, where there's policies, laws, and institutions that reproduce racial inequalities. One way individual discrimination works is through implicit bias. An implicit bias refers to the unreasoned judgmental inclinations that operate without necessarily our conscious awareness. When we expect excellence, we see excellence. When we expect errors, we find errors. And it was this particular example from the reading where a group of researchers crafted a fictitious legal research memo and asked 60 law partners to evaluate the memo. The memo contained 7 deliberate spelling and grammatical errors. The partners all received the same memo. However, half were told the author was Black, and the other half were told the author was white. The partners were asked to find the errors in the memo. Evaluators who were told that the author was Black found more of the embedded errors and rated the memo as lower quality than did those partners who were told the author was white. So this is an example of implicit bias, right? If you have a bias that white folks are going to be able to write a much more grammatically correct memo, then that's what you're going to see when you're reading a memo that you think has been written by a white person, versus the opposite if you have an implicit bias about African Americans not being able to be good at writing. The audit study was another example that captures these discrepancies in the marketplace. This was where a number of resumes were sent out with African-American sounding names versus white sounding names. And that was the only difference in the resume. Everything else on the resume was exactly the same. And what they found is that those resumes that were named Lakeisha and Jamal needed to send out 15 resumes to get a call back for employment, whereas those resumes for Emily and Greg needed to send out 10 resumes. Now you also have sort of the institutional structural differences in the economy that impact different racial groups in different kinds of ways. So one area or one structural difference that has occurred that the reading talked about is deindustrialization, changes in the labor market of the United States, which were particularly detrimental to Black men. Up until the 1980s, many Black men were employed in manufacturing jobs, which provided benefits and a family wage, permitting families to attain comfortable standards of living. Once these factories began to close, these comfortable lifestyles went with them. So you see this difference, this particular decline here. The percentage of the US labor force in manufacturing has dropped significantly as manufacturing has been basically outsourced to other parts of the world. That's what deindustrialization means. But if you were part of a population that was heavily employed in manufacturing, once those manufacturing companies left, you were left unemployed. So the reading talked about two particular things when trying to understand Black unemployment. The skills mismatch hypothesis, which asks who has the skills to work in the current economy, and spatial mismatch hypothesis, which asks where has the job growth taken place. And what this is getting at is that if manufacturing jobs were the ones that were hiring many African Americans and those jobs left, then what kind of skills are required by the jobs that we have in today's economy that are mostly either service oriented and therefore low paid, or high-tech oriented and requires then a certain level of education, which costs money and so on. So that's the skills mismatch hypothesis, that the skills that many in the African-American community have does not match the current kind of jobs that exist in our economy. The spatial mismatch hypothesis is referring to where have the new jobs been created. A lot of manufacturing corporations existed in urban environments or close to the cities. Well, once they left and they weren't replaced with anything else, a lot of the current economic employment that exists outside of cities. And so if there is no work being created in the places where people live, it's going to lead to unemployment. Now, another assumption sometimes is whether women and minorities can escape inequality by forming their own businesses. But here we see that the response to that is no. A part of what the reading calls ethnic enclave economies explains why it is that having your own business as a person of color isn't necessarily going to get you out of poverty or isn't going to put a huge dent in the income inequality that exists, because a lot of the businesses that are created by people of color are within their own ethnic enclave communities. And so they're dependent on that particular source of consumers or clients and so on. So you see here by gender, firms owned by men, and the revenue stream, how much higher it is than those owned by women. And by race and ethnicity, you see the significant difference there between those that are owned by white versus those that are owned by other groups of color. So to conclude, non-whites continue to be disadvantaged in the labor market. It is difficult or even impossible to simply legislate away discrimination, especially when thinking about individual racism, right? How do you create a law that is able to somehow capture whether a person looking at a resume has implicit bias, and that somehow directing the kinds of decisions they make as to who they call back for an interview. Growth in certain industries and contraction in others are due to global forces that are beyond the control of a single government. So this whole global economy that we live in now complicates what can be done in terms of addressing some of these income inequality issues. The labor market and the small business market are structured by deeply entrenched inequalities, as we saw depicted in some of the graphs before. So this ends our lecture for this week. I will see you guys next time.